All right, so we're ready to get started. Welcome. This webinar is organized by the Circular Electronics Initiative, an initiative formed just a couple of weeks ago. We're very happy about this. It has its roots in an initiative or a movement, you could say, called the Circular Electronics Day that has been running for a few years. But the companies behind this thought, why only communicate about circular electronics one day a year? Let's keep the dialogue going. So we decided that we're going to form an initiative, and thanks to that, we're also able to organize this webinar today. And there are more than 20 organizations backing the Circular Electronics Initiative, and if you're curious about it, you can log on to the webpage and read more about other activities. I'm Cassandra Julin from TCO Development, the organization behind TCO Certified, who's also the project lead for the Circular Electronics Initiative. This webinar will be available on demand, so don't worry if you have to leave early or want your colleagues to hear about the discussions going on today. You'll get the link afterwards and you'll be able to share it forward. If you want to ask questions, there's going to be plenty of opportunities for that. So use the chat box to ask away, and I'm going to try to read as many of them as possible. So welcome, and without further delay, let's introduce you to our first speaker today. So that's Alexandra Wu from IVL, the Swedish Environmental Institute, who's going to start you off. So welcome, Alexandra.
Thanks. So I'll try to share my screen now.
Can't hear you right now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great.
So you're going to talk a little bit about the circular economy and how it's applicable to electronics.
Yes. Are you able to see the slides?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Okay. Great. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Super happy to be here to talk about circular economy and electronics. I'm from IVL, the Swedish Environmental Research Institute. And for those of you who don't know about us, we are an independent research institute that was founded in Sweden. We do applied research and consultancy projects across a very broad scale of sustainability issues, circular economy being one of the main areas that we focus on. I myself work in a group called Waste and Sustainable Resource Flows, and I have a very heavy focus on circular economy, especially in the industries of electronics and batteries. So for this presentation today, there are sort of four main questions that I really want to address. The first is, why should we even care about electronics issues in the first place? What is the circular economy and how does it apply to electronics? And what can actually be done in order to transition towards the circular economy in electronics? With the first question, why should we care? Well, if you didn't already know, electronic waste or e-waste is one of the fastest growing waste streams globally. In 2019 alone, we produced 53 million tons of e-waste, and by weight, that is equal to about 8 pyramids of Giza, and that's just on an annual basis. And when we talk about e-waste, we're not only talking about computers and laptops and phones, but we're also including here appliances, big and small, and lamps, screens and monitors, refrigerators, and IT equipment. Some of the drivers of why we're producing so much e-waste include the fact that household disposable income across the world has been growing. People are moving in rapid rates into cities where, of course, more electronic equipment is used. And advanced technologies making production and industrialization of producing electronics has made a lot more efficient. And the result of this is that there's a lot more electronic equipment and products being placed on the market. On the other hand, we as consumers are consuming more electronic equipment and more different kinds of electronic equipment. But for various reasons, this equipment and the products have short life cycles, either because of low quality or planned obsolescence, so the product stops working after a while artificially, maybe because, for example, the company producing it is no longer supporting it with software updates, or maybe because consumers just don't want to have that same product and they want to get something new or get the latest models. And lastly, there are still very few repair options for us to, or for the products to be repaired or upgraded to make them last longer. Of the 53 million tons of e-waste that is produced, only 17% of that is actually documented to be collected and properly recycled. You can see here that most of the recycling and collection rates, it's highest in Europe, but 42% is still very low. And when we do recycle e-waste, most of the time we're recovering materials like aluminum, copper, and iron, and that's just the tip of the iceberg of all the metals and materials and critical materials that are used to produce electronic products. On the other hand, about 80% of the global e-waste flows are not actually documented. A significant fraction of it is estimated to be exported as secondhand products or as e-waste to countries where the waste treatment is typically not environmentally sound. And so we end up seeing environmental pollution and human health impacts in those countries. And lastly, a fraction of this e-waste is also discarded into waste bins in high-income countries, which ends up contaminating our other waste streams and also end up polluting the environment. And electronics issues is not exclusive to the end of life when we throw our electronic equipment away as waste. If we look at the production of a smartphone, for example, here this diagram shows the fractions of all the types of waste that is produced in the production of one smartphone. And if we start in this pie chart, you can actually see that most of the waste is accounted for in sulfidic tailings in the mining stage. And then the rest can be broken down into these types of waste, most of which are also affiliated with the mining stage. So it is really in the mining of the raw materials and the metals that are used in producing electronic equipment that is very intensive for the environment. And so electronics issues can be found across the life cycle of electronic equipment. So with all the depressing facts and that overview, let's turn to the question of what exactly is circular economy and how can we look at circular economy in application to electronics. If we look at global economic systems in general since the age of the Industrial Revolution, for the most part, the economic system can be described as linear, where we take raw materials, we produce stuff with it, we use it, and then we throw it away. And typically this is described as a take, make, waste type of system. But if we move towards a circular economy, what we're looking at is to try to cycle and reuse the materials and resources within the system so that we reduce as much as possible the raw materials that are entering the system and reduce as much as possible the waste that is either leaked or somehow emitted from the system. And in a theoretical, completely circular economy, we would have a completely closed loop system where all materials and resources will be cycled only within that system. And it's important to highlight here that circular economy should not be the end goal, but it could be a tool or a means to an end, and a tool and an approach for societies to tackle major environmental issues like climate change and biodiversity loss. And at the same time, use this as an opportunity to address social needs and to decouple economic growth from environmental pollution and impacts to the environment. So how do we actually, what strategies do we have and what approaches do we have to move towards a circular economy? There are many different frameworks and explanations, but this is one of my favorites that I will show you. It's called the 9R framework. If we look at circular economy as a sliding scale where one end is much more leaning on the linear side and the other end is more on the circular side, then on the more linear side, we look at strategies and approaches that use materials in a more efficient way. So recycling is a common one, or recovery, where we incinerate material to recover energy. And as many of you might know, this is very common in Sweden, where a large fraction of our wastes are incinerated to power homes and heat buildings. IKEA and Coca-Cola are examples of companies that have adopted some sort of goal, either to make all their products or packaging recyclable, or to use recycled material to produce new products. As we move up the circularity scale, we start to see strategies that look at extending the lifespan of products and its parts. And we can do that by repurposing, remanufacturing, refurbishing, repairing, or reusing. Blocket is an example of a Swedish platform where users can go on the platform and buy and sell secondhand products to each other. Fairphone is an example of a phone production company that, in addition to using sustainably sourced materials where possible, they also design their phones in a way to make it easier for users to repair and refurbish and upgrade on their own. And Nudie Jeans is an example of a company that provides repair and refurbishment services as well for their denim products. And then on the more advanced scale of the circularity spectrum, we see strategies that look at smarter product use and manufacturing. And this includes reduce in the sense of reducing the inefficiencies in product manufacture and use. And we can do that by, for example, using fewer natural resources and materials. There's Rethink, which is making a product use more intensive, for example, by sharing a product. And Airbnb and Uber are examples of this, where we are taking living spaces or apartments or cars and making the use of these services and items more intensive, thereby increasing the efficiency of the use of these things. And lastly, there is Refuse, which is making a product actually even redundant or abandoning its function, or by offering the same function, but with a radically different product or a service system. So then now we move to, what do we mean by the circularity economy of electronics? How do we apply all of these things to electronics? If we take a generic life cycle of a product like electronics, we have the product design, going to procurement, to manufacturing, sales, marketing, use, and then end of life disposal. And there are sort of 5 main business models that we can look at to apply the circular economy of electronics. The first is looking at the design stage to design electronic products for circularity. This includes designing products to last longer, for products to make it easier to repair or to recycle or to recover materials. We can look at strategies in circular supplies. So for example, designing products and procuring parts and materials that are either renewable or from recycled sources. We can look at resource recovery, taking waste as a resource by taking waste and byproducts from other production processes and then feeding that into the design of a product or into the manufacturing of that product to make material use more efficient. And we can also look at resource recovery in the sense of recycling. And then we can also look at product life extension in remanufacturing, reselling, repairing, or upgrading a product. And here I would emphasize again the importance for the linkage of this to the design for circularity approach, because a product needs to be easy to remanufacture, repair, and upgrade. And the design of this is very important to make it easy to resell and repair and upgrade. There's also strategies in sharing. So we're looking at different ownership systems for a product, or taking a product as a service. So for example, laptop leasing is an example of where this is applied for electronics. And so I moved now to the question of what can actually be done by different actors in order to transition towards the circular economy of electronics. And here I just kind of touch on the main actors that come to mind, but of course there's a lot more that can still be said. But for example, on the policymaker side, policymakers can design policies that incentivize and support circular businesses rather than make it actually more difficult or form barriers. Examples of this include revising tax systems that would actually reduce repair costs, to make circular procurement a requirement and scale that up and make that more of a norm, and to set circularity standards so that industries and producers can align on circularity, the circularity measures that are taken when it comes to electronics. On the producer side, producers can design products for circularity. For example, as mentioned, to make them repairable, make them modular so that the parts can be easier to be replaced or repaired or upgraded, to make products longer lasting, or to source materials that are recycled or renewable. They can also engage in circular business models to create value that is just beyond the consumption of material products, to shift to new ownership models. So leasing is an example of that, and we're seeing increasingly that companies are moving more towards a leasing model for electronic products, and to form innovative partnerships with different actors, because in order to move towards a circular economy, as you can see, we need action and engagement across the value chain. And here I think retailers can have a role too, because retailers, like producers, have the main interface with the consumers, and retailers are also very engaged in the marketing of the products that are sold to consumers. So I think here there's a great opportunity for retailers to take a role to promote and normalize circular consumption, and to build the sense of the reputation and the sense towards customers that secondhand products are reliable and that they could be just as good. And lastly, on the consumer side, all of us as consumers, I think on a more practical level, reuse practices are things that we can already engage in, to wherever possible repair our products, buy secondhand, see if certain products don't actually need to be owned in our households. Tools, power tools, for example, is an example of a type of product that most of us probably don't really need to own, but that if we can either share with neighbors or in our communities or rent from the hardware store, then that is a circular thing we can do when it comes to this type of product. And then lastly, I think maybe on a broader scale, it would be great if consumers can also sort of rethink for all of us how we consume. And what I mean by rethink is to ask ourselves some key questions for when we're thinking about buying something or getting something. So we might start by asking ourselves, do I really need or want this product? If so, then do I already have something that serves the same function? If it's yes, then is it already broken, or do I just want something new? If it's broken, can it be repaired or upgraded? If it can be repaired or upgraded, then that's great. That's a circular thing to do. Or if we actually just want something new, and that's of course a common condition, or if something can't be repaired or upgraded, then we can ask ourselves if we can buy it secondhand, and if does it make financial sense to buy secondhand. And then if all of these questions are no, and we really need to buy something new, then we can try to prioritize getting environmentally friendly products. And I think by shifting the way consumers think about consumption, we can try to start to steer our consumption patterns towards those that are more environmentally friendly and more friendly towards a circular economy as well. And I think there are great opportunities when it comes to reuse, not only for the consumer, but also for businesses in the market as well. Because especially in a higher income country like Sweden, where product turnover is high, we see a lot of reusable secondhand electronics coming onto the market. And so this resource stock of reusable secondhand electronics is high, and it tends to be also concentrated because they tend to be concentrated in urban areas and cities. On the other hand, this resource stock has reuse value. And so this is value that can be captured on the market. So that's on the sort of the supply side of reusable secondhand electronics. And on the demand side, the demand for secondhand is also growing, not only in Sweden, but also in Europe and internationally. And then lastly, if we look at the logistics of running a reuse system for electronics products, it's actually, theoretically, it's comparatively easier than another circular approach like remanufacturing or recycling, because the transport of the products should, at least on a theoretical level, be concentrated to the cities and the urban areas, or at least it doesn't have to be cycled back through to manufacturing plants or recycling plants and so on. So this is just a very brief introduction, maybe just to spark some discussion when it comes to circular economy in electronics. And thank you so much, and we can discuss more during the Q&A.
Thank you, Alex. Very, very insightful presentation. I mean, I've obviously heard you before speaking about electronics and the circular economy and kind of how they interlink. And I think you're doing a great work with IVL, kind of spreading the knowledge and sharing your expertise. One thing that stands out with me is when you talk about the key drivers, kind of who can make this happen. You talk about legislation and policymakers, you talk about the producers, consumers, and so on. But is there any of these drivers that you think have a greater role than the others? Like, where would you say the power to kind of accelerate sits?
Oh, I love that question. Also because it's so hard to answer. To be honest,
sure.
Yeah, I think that it's a little bit like all of these different actors are holding a rope and we're trying to pull a wagon, and we can't have only one person pulling the wagon without the other. I think we all need to move together. And so I think policy has a big role in setting the stage and driving things and moving things forward. While policy can be slow, it's also about shifting consumer behavior and the way we think, and producers also depend on consumers for how they shift, and they also depend on policy. So I think the linkages are so interconnected that I think we just need to find the smartest way to all move together.
That's a great answer. Thank you, Alexandra. I also love the image you showed with a kind of think pattern when you're standing in front of a choice, if you need a new product or a service, to kind of really apply the circular economy thinking and go through the scheme and see, do I really need a new product? Yes or no? Do I need to own it? Can I rent it? Are there refurbished alternatives? But the really hard part I find as a kind of consumer, which I often am, or a buyer of products and services, is it's hard to know how to make the best choice. It's really hard to be involved enough to know what the better options are when it comes to CO2 emissions, or when it comes to kind of, and different products have different imprints on the environment as well. Is there any guidance you can give on this, or any kind of a general way to think, or would you refer back to this think map that you showed earlier, that's kind of a good place to start?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I can't think of at this moment specific guidance for consumers. I can definitely dig into that, but that was also the reason why I created this, because those are the key questions that we always talk about, and they kind of like float around, alongside each other. But to me, it was starting to conceptualize itself that it's almost like an algorithm, because and producers and businesses won't like to hear this, but I think one of the first things we could do from the circular economy perspective and environmental perspective is not to consume. So if we have something and we really don't need something new or something else, one of the first things we could do is do nothing. Or if we really want something or need something, then I think then you can go through these stepwise sort of decisions and questions, so that first you try the more circular options first before deciding on the less circular one.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. And I think also that's kind of the fun part about watching the circular economy in practice is that it kind of creates new business models as well that are more circular and kind of creates a shift in a lot of organizations to take more circular approaches because they see the demand being there for those alternatives, like you showed, like Uber, Airbnb, Blocket, like IKEA and Coca-Cola's work. It really shows that there is room for organizations and companies to kind of make that shift. So should we let our other panelists into the discussions? I mean, there are so many great questions, and I want to make sure we give everyone a little bit of time to answer. We have Camilla Cederqvist from Atea with us today, and also Claire Hobby from TCO Development. So Claire, do you want to reflect a little bit about Alexandra's presentation, and maybe we can take the focus on kind of who are the key drivers? I mean, you work with the purchasers a lot. Do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Alex, too, for all your research and good advice. And I'm wondering if I might kind of build on your previous question that you explored a little bit about drivers. And you know, clearly that the principles and the research is in place about, you know, circular models and where we need to be headed in the big picture. But sometimes I like to strip this question back to very, very basics and talk about the business of getting circularity done. And time again, I come back to the fact that demand drives supply. Like in many, many business situations, right? Demand drives supply. So I see this from my perspective as a call to action for some of the volume buyers out there, those of you working in government space or private sector space, responsible for maybe a kind of large inventory of IT hardware for your organization. When you step into this question, early in your procurement process, talk to your vendors, talk to the brands or the suppliers that you're dealing with, and really communicate that this is a priority for you. Using those products longer, maybe selling them on for reuse after your first use cycle. Really moving this circularity decision higher up the value chain where you're going to be having the highest impact on what the brands and the manufacturers can deliver to you, rather than waiting till it's on the desktop and think, oh, what do we do with it now? So I would encourage those of you in the audience today that are working in larger organizations or even smaller organizations to really think about how are we communicating with our vendor community around circularity.
And Camilla, in your role, you are the kind of middleman. You work with the big buyers and kind of try to supply them with IT solutions and so on. What do you hear from the big purchaser community, and what kind of demands do you hear when it comes to more circular solutions? And is there a trend?
Well, let me begin by saying that I wish there was more push on the demand side. But of course, we have a number of really engaged buyers in the Nordics that are really pushing the boundaries, and Malmö City is one that is gaining international traction for how they're trying to work around circular procurement and circular IT. So specific trends regarding circularity, there is definitely an increased interest in reused and also around getting guidance and advice on how to procure more sustainably, but also how to manage your whole IT during the life cycle. So to go back to what Alexandra said about well, the producers and the resellers don't like to hear this about the inner loops or the top in your 9R framework. I think that's absolutely key in circularity, and tough shit, we have to adjust to this and because this is the future and we all have to live with it. And yes, it is a tough transition, especially if you're locked into a linear business model, but we on the producer and reseller side have to see how we can add value to the products rather than just selling them and living off the transactions. And I think there's a lot to do that there, and it's really exciting to see what the future has in mind.
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
But does it have to be more expensive? I mean, circular solutions, we talked a little bit about Sweden, and that Sweden is a kind of high consumer of electronics, and we have a kind of history of buying new products in larger organizations and so on. But is budget kind of a driver for a circular economy or an obstacle, or is it more about putting it in the right framework or system? What's your kind of take on that? I don't know, Claire, do you want to reflect on it first?
Budget is always on the table, right? It's never not an issue.
Right.
But we're actually starting, I think we're starting to see some really interesting cases of organizations that have used circular procurement or innovation in procurement to their bottom line outcome advantage too. So if we take the case of longer use, right? We've got a lot of purchasers who are really trying to extend that first use cycle by 1 year, let's say. And there's some good examples of, apart from anything, the sheer cost savings of deferring that new product purchase that little bit longer. But also, you know, if you're able to repair a product, you know, plan for those battery cycle, those battery replacements as well, right? That will give you a longer life. There's also really interesting innovation going on around selling your used products, right? And really trying to find, someone mentioned earlier, the embedded value that's in the products you're using now. And, you know, trying to find that sweet spot where you've got a good solid first use out of that product. Where is the embedded value that makes it viable to sell that on to a second user, sell it to a refurbish process where you're still able to capture some of that value, not using it so long that it's no longer valuable for that refurb process or remanufacturing process. So I think there's some very interesting work going on out there to really show some very good bottom line outcomes. And let's not forget that, you know, if we take the work that we're doing with TCO Certified, for example, and putting in design criteria that set the groundwork for longer product life, those products are commercially available. These are not super niche products. These are commercially off-the-shelf available products that many organizations are already buying. So circular solutions, more circular solutions, are well within the budgets of most corporate buyers.
Can I maybe add
Alex,
something?
yeah, go ahead.
Just because I thought of something that Claire is saying. I think in addition to those considerations about budget, I think there's also value in investing in circular approaches in your business model, also because of a sort of the resilience perspective. There was a study done by a Belgian research institute that found that surveyed businesses during the COVID pandemic, the peak of the COVID pandemic, and their business models, and those that were running more on a circular business model were doing better than those that were on a linear business model. So even though I think in many cases circular solutions in electronics is still could be relatively new, it can be seen as an investment that can bring value in the longer term.
Excellent point. Did you also want to jump in, Camilla? I saw your hand.
Yes. I think from a purchaser's perspective, it's sometimes too much focus on the purchasing price. And I understand that how you end up there, because most often you have like a purchasing department that handles all the purchase, and sometimes there is not enough internal dialogue around like those top R's in the R framework. But I heard some figure that there are like 20 or 25 million mobile phones stored in Swedish homes today. And I think it looks the same in businesses, of course. So you buy something and you're really concerned with the price of what you're buying, but then you're totally fine with just putting that in a drawer later and having it sit there and lose all that embedded value. So you need to think of the total cost of ownership, and I think that's something that we'll see more of further on. And I also think purchasers need guidance on how to think and how to value different options in regards to that.
I think that's a really good point, and we had some input from the Circular Electronics Initiative from some other organizations about that earlier in the year, where they've seen a real upswing on the secondhand market of products. Just like you say, it's so sad to know all of these cell phones and laptops and everything else just sitting around. But I think with the awareness of the value within the product, there's also, you know, business models, not necessarily their old business model, the secondhand market, but, you know, old business model that's kind of coming up to life, and people realize that, you know, the value in a product is not just when I use it, it could be valuable for someone else, and it could bring me extra value also later on. So that's something, yeah.
Sorry to bust in there, but maybe we can do a little bit of myth busting too around refurbished, remanufactured. I think there's maybe some hesitation out there also on, oh, if I buy a remanufactured, refurbished product, it's not going to perform as well as a brand new one. And I think that's somewhat of a myth. I think there's amazing refurbished, remanufactured offerings out there that for the vast majority of functions that we need in our day-to-day work perform beautifully. And so I would strongly encourage those of you in the market for technology to put refurbished and remanufactured options in your mix. We're starting to see some procurement tenders out there that to kind of push circular thinking are including a minimum of the supply is actually remanufactured or refurbished, which I think is a really easy way to signal to the supply base that, you know, let's try this. Let's kind of side by side a little refurbished options plus a mix of new. So I think there are some really creative ways to test that out.
Maybe you want to continue, Claire, as well, because something that we've discussed a lot recently is the right to repair movement that is just, you know, blowing across the world right now. In a lot of markets, there's legislation ongoing, or at least initiatives ongoing, and that's obviously a huge pusher or enabler for the circular economy and circular solutions, like we're saying, to actually be able to repair and upgrade and so on, so the products can live longer. Is a kind of a key starting point for a circular economy. Do you want to reflect on that, who's been in those dialogues, Claire?
Yeah, it's kind of wild, isn't it? We're seeing the right to repair movement just spread across many markets. You might have seen the French repairability index that's coming online for electronics. We've got new policy investigations in the UK, in Australia, even in the United States. So there's a lot of chatter about right to repair with good reason. I think we have struggled with the ability to have our electronics repaired at a cost that does not come in line with new product replacement. That's a real problem. Access to product schematics and repair manuals have been problematic as well. So it's a whole slew of issues connected to our inability to repair certain products. On that front, though, I think what I see in this debate is that there's a lot of focus on the consumer, individual private citizens. And I think while that's a fair assumption that that's where legislation needs to go, I want to encourage again the volume buyers out there, because you are the ones with sustainable procurement mandates, sustainability goals. You're also representing a volume of procurement that is really interesting for the industry to hear about. And you are the ones that can really have leverage at scale. So I think right to repair is a really interesting catalyst to the broader circular economy for electronics. But I think rather than thinking about products when they're on the desktop and how do we repair them now, let's move that dialogue up the value chain into product design. How do we influence product design in a way that permits that repairability, that longer use in the first place? So again, volume buyers, you're up. get your voice in there.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. The questions are rolling in also from the audience, which is great. Keep them coming. One of the questions that just came up is also the balance between the different actors within a product. So the example is the hardware and software companies, you know, and the kind of planned obsolescence and kind of how. Because one of the things when I think about the circular economy is always, you know, if you make it too short term or if you make it, you know, it may not be able to work. You need kind of multiple players, you need interaction, and you need a kind of will from different ways to make it happen successfully. Does someone want to reflect on this or kind of bring up some enablers or some thoughts around this? It's a tough one.
I haven't been following all the specific debates and the dialogue on planned obsolescence, but last I checked, I think the EU is making some movement when it comes to having a regulatory push so that producers can't sort of run away crazy with planned obsolescence. I think to me that's a very positive signal. Again, I don't remember specifically on what product groups that is being applied to, but I think that is very important, and I hope to see more in that direction. And I think on the other hand, in this sense, I think consumers can also have a big influence on this. I think if we all come together to demonstrate that this is not acceptable, then I hope that can also shift behavior in the way the producers work and also how products are designed as well.
Yeah, and I keep reading the questions that are coming in. One of the madnesses that someone reflected on when it comes to electronics is, you know, these are value, like you were talking about in the beginning of our presentation, Alexandra, that, you know, these resources are scarce. We need to look after them. We can't just keep, you know, taking them out on the environment and then we put them into IT products and we ship them to places where they're being dumped in landfills. It's just mad. When there's value in this, there's obviously, you know, for someone, and not talking about the ones illegally exporting it and placing it in landfills, but there is value for these to stay within the circular loops, and there are values in these products. How can we put a shift to make use of that? Is there like, we talked a little bit about policy or legislation and consumer demand. Is there a way to kind of tackle this that we haven't really thought about? Or it's also a very tough question, I know, but we have good questions from the audience coming.
Is that more a question? Do you mean specifically more on illegal shipment of e-waste?
Well, the question was on the illegal shipments, but I think my question, I kind of adapted it a little bit, is how do we make sure that these resources and valuable resources, if I call them, that we keep hold of them, that we keep valuing them within the ecosystem, and that we, you know, keep applying them in the circular economy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think spontaneously, I think all major actors have a role in this. Policymakers have a role in regulating the way that electronics waste is collected, and in such a way that we wouldn't be leaking materials outside of the jurisdiction it should be in. I think the EU setting targets with the Waste Electric Equipment Directive is also good, because I think the ambition on that has been increasing, and not only from collection, but also more towards recycling and reuse. It's still in its infancy, but I think that type of regulatory push will also drive the market to want to keep the equipment within, well, the EU, for example. I think consumers also have a role in that, in knowing of how to appropriately dispose of e-waste so that it doesn't get leaked out of the system as well. Or again, going back to the point of when there is still embedded reuse value, where can it go before it becomes waste? And I think one of the biggest things, sorry, just to finish off, is just don't throw your waste tablets and phones into the mixed bin. That's just one thing none of us should do.
That's a very good point. And there's another question touching a little bit about what you're talking about.
Could I just comment on
yes.
what? Yes.
Yes, let's do that before we go ahead. Sure.
I just wanted to see what we see from a reseller perspective, and that is usually our customers or IT buyers or users, they're very aware of the e-waste problem and all of that. But what is lacking is you don't have the processes, you don't have the policies in place, you don't have assigned responsibilities within the organization to actually manage your IT assets and what happens with them at end of life. And that's why they end up in drawers and with unknown fate. So there's from the industry perspective, we have a lot to do there, helping our customers to actually get those processes in place. So where a product is no longer in use, it shall be returned for proper handling, for reuse or recycling. So I think that's a really important perspective, because products that are not in use, they are the worst kind of products.
Yeah, and that's actually spot on to my point as well, that should this be tackled through legislation or incentives? You know, we have in Sweden, we have a very strong example of the PET plastic bottles that you drink in, that when you go to the store, it's not included in the price in the shop, but you actually pay a little small price for that bottle that you then get back when you recycle it. So it's a kind of lending price, I would say, or something that, you know, you pay it now, but you get it back when you return it. That could be applied for electronics either through an incentive, or it could be, you know, mandatory through legislation to make it actually illegal to discard electronics in your normal bin. Or is that kind of pushing it too hard, like forcing people? What are your thoughts about that? And especially from a buyer perspective? Yeah, Claire.
Yeah, so yeah, such an interesting topic. And I mean, there's certainly, it's certainly a problematic area, right? So there's even many examples of companies that mean really well. They want to put their used products back into a responsible recovery stream, but there's even examples of those products being further sold on to some other processor, and then next thing you know, your products are showing up in an e-waste dump in Africa, which is absolutely not the intention of the vast majority of buyers, right? So traceability of where our products land is a huge problem. I want to point to just one thing that's emerging is the idea of a product passport. And there's a few projects going on looking into this concept. One of them is called the KEEP project. And if anyone's interested in learning more, feel free to reach out to me, and happy to connect you. But the idea of actually being able to trace the product itself throughout its life cycle is becoming something that a voluntary approach to solving this problem. The other side that I wanted to remind people about is that some items in a computer are going to get recycled. And I'm hearing this from the brands, you know, straight from their mouths, that, you know, when it comes to valuable metals and things that have a reuse, those are often going to get recovered. When it comes to something like plastic, obviously a completely different picture. So what we need to do again is influence product design. If we have products on our desk that are full of a plastic that we don't know what that plastic contains, there's every chance when it comes to its end of life, we're not going to be able to recover and reuse that safely or within the boundaries of policy. So if we can work up front and design and influence the design of products made from safer materials that we know what they contain in the first place, our chances of reusing that and looping it back are much, much better when it's being used. So just want to flag those two issues.
Yeah, and very important. You talk about also the product passport. I mean, one of the things that we often discuss is that we actually need to know what's in the product to be able to know how to then handle them later on in the stream. We need to be able to go back and trace the contaminants in the materials and so on. This is going to be discussed by the European Circular Economy Stakeholder Platform in an EU Circular talk soon. So I recommend to check that out if you want to follow that discussion more closely, because there will be an hour just on this. But time is running out and we have so many great questions. But I think one of the things that I really want to finish with, because we talked a lot about, what are the problems and what are people doing right now, who can kind of be the driver for this, who can make this shift happen and all the stuff going on. But what's the next step then? Okay, if we know all of this, the background, kind of what's happened, and we're really good at talking about this part of the discussion, but what's the magic next step for the circular economy community? And it could be short term and it could be long term. It would be really interesting to hear your recommendation. Does someone want to start, or should I point someone out? All right, Claire, you go ahead first.
Oh, okay. So just really quickly, I mean, if we take away one thing from this conversation, do know that about an estimated 70% of the life cycle sustainability impact of the computers you're using happens before it even lands on your desk. If you just think about that. So clearly, we need to stop perpetuating this, let's say, 3-year replacement cycle, because then we're causing those impacts time and time and time again. So start by using your products longer. Just start by figuring out, could I use this product 1 more year? And after I've done using it, really think about redeploying that product in your organization. The amount of times this is overlooked is staggering, and I think there's a lot of opportunity being missed to reuse, share, put it in another department within your own organization. So I would say start there. And these other big issues, yes, we're going to get to those, but talk to your vendors, use longer. I think those are great places to start.
Thank you, Claire. Camilla.
Yeah, and I think an important message that I always try to convey is that don't
I lost audio there.
Yeah, I lost audio as well, Camilla. Sorry, we cannot hear you. All right, Camilla, I'm so sorry, we cannot hear you. Alex, while we fix Camilla's sound, do you want to go ahead instead and give your perspective on the kind of next step for the circular economy community?
Sure. I guess I don't really have a super practical suggestion for the next step, but maybe it's a little bit more long-term and abstract. I really believe in the force of shifting, our attitudes and thinking towards something. So if you find this stuff interesting, I would just say try to follow the discussion, learn more about the circular economy. The Ellen MacArthur Foundation is probably one of the most digestible and interesting sort of places to start. Yeah, I think that would be my top of mind.
Great, thank you. Camilla, let's see if your sound has come back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can. Great.
Oh, great. Well, I was just saying that the message that I always try to convey is that we need to take action. And that's the most important thing now. We're in the decade of action, and we can't sit around and setting targets anymore. We need to start doing stuff. So to everyone, just start thinking, what can you do? What can you start with doing today? Is it to return your used IT? We see that maybe 30% of the IT that we put on the market comes back. So there we have a big thing to do, and everyone can start doing it really. So that's my most important message.
So we have shift attitudes, take action, and use your IT equipment 1 more year, and then you already have a start. I think that's a great summary from our panelists. So on behalf of the Circular Electronics Initiative, I'd like to put a huge thanks to our panelists and a presenter. It was a great pleasure to moderate this session, and I've learned a lot from you guys, and I hope the audience has too. We got a couple of questions about the presentations and so on, and as mentioned in the beginning, everything is available on demand, so you'll get the link afterwards with the presentation and everything. So if you have more questions or want to engage, there is the Circular Electronics Initiative, so get in touch, and I hope to continue this dialogue with everyone going forward as well. Thank you for today, and wish you all a nice rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.